Australians are to gambling what the United States is to guns. Hello, welcome to Dangerous Policy, a channel aimed at intelligent people wanting to discuss important issues facing life and society. My name is Crispin, and today I'm going to talk about the most underreported story about Australia in the world stage. And I'm allowed to talk about it now because in government I was sort of working in a related field. I wasn't comfortable discussing this in the podcast, but not doing that anymore. Australians spend vastly more per head of population on gambling than anywhere else in the world. In fact, we are so far ahead, it isn't even worth talking about second place. Australians gamble on everything. We will gamble on which grass blade will grow fastest. We will gamble on which snail will cross the thing. And I remember doing this in primary school. Snail races, we'll gamble marbles. And raised on it. We have a public holiday in one of our states for a horse race. The entire country will stop and watch it every year, and everyone around will have some sort of bet on it, even if they don't know anything about horse racing, because it is part of the culture. Our sporting language has changed dramatically. We don't say, "Oh, what do you think the chances are of X team winning this particular game?" They'll say, "Okay, we'll give them 2-1 favorite," or it's probably $1.90, something like that. Like we will say, we'll talk in terms of odds as part of our everyday speech, and thus, and also just the sheer gamble of Australians as part of the culture in terms of everything, in terms of risk taking, in terms of that part of larrikinism. I mean, I don't know whether it's been the gambling industry or whether it's something that has happened naturally and organically through our Anglo-Celtic culture, but certainly is an accepted thing that, there's a chance that something might happen, ergo, let's have a punt on it, be the local vernacular. And also like, if you manage to get this ball in the hoop, whatever, I'll give you X dollars. I bet you $20 you can't do it. Like, this is part of every sort of speech. It's extraordinary what has happened to various communities because of that fact. So Australia's money is mostly spent on what we call the pokies. Some others call it the one-armed bandits. Electronic gaming machine is the technical term. It was actually invented in Australia, and in fact in certain parts of the United States it's still called the Australian gambling machine or gaming machine, and that is something that allows people to sit there, press a button, pull a lever, and over the course of hours just give away their money to a device. And to most people there is a certain repugnance about this technology, that people kind of go into what they call the zone, where they get like an infrequent and unpredictable dopamine reinforcement through wins, even if those wins are less than the money that they've put in, and keeps people addicted to these machines. And if you go to an Australian casino or an Australian club, you'll see just rows and rows and rows of these machines, particularly older people there, retirees, people who might be a bit lonely, people who might be going through some emotional trauma, people seeking to escape from their other mental problems that they have in their life, their real life challenges, and people simply escaping from the pain of being a gambling addict themselves, sitting there pressing these buttons day in, day out, losing their life savings, their superannuation, some of them turning to crime, some of them turning to violence in order to feed this habit, all of the vicissitudes and calamities of crime and cultural life. Within most states and territories in Australia, these machines are ubiquitous in the pubs and clubs around the country. As in, like, you're not just in the casino, but you are in every single kind of place you go have a drink. Even in some convenience stores and things like that will have them, like in the corner. if you've ever been to Las Vegas, it's like that in most places in Australia. We just have these machines everywhere, and so much money goes through them. In fact, there's a disproportionate amount of the money that goes through them in poor areas. So, I was in a poor area of Tasmania doing some work, and the amount of money that was going through those machines seemed impossible given the average income of the people that lived in that area. And meaning that basically everybody's pay packets went through these machines who was living in entire swaths of the community. Hard to imagine areas with very high unemployment, a lot of social problems. Gambling was the predominant form of entertainment for most people. Now, I'm not, obviously as a poker player, I am not against gambling. I probably gamble as much as anybody that I know. But my gambling is pro-social. I do it with people I know, and it's part of the culture. I'm not against it. And I find that restrictions on gambling in Australia have been largely counterproductive in many ways. So, for example, the federal government has taken control of gambling online because of the Communications Act. By an accident of history, the internet itself is a federal jurisdiction in Australia, which means that although gambling is regulated in every state jurisdiction, anything that happens online is restricted by the federal government. And they've effectively banned it outright. And I think that was a terrible mistake because that way people are driven to all kinds of illegal sites. They do things completely, through crypto and other forms of spending. Like, it doesn't stop it at all. But all of the things that might improve player safety, ID, self-harm kind of tools, spending limits, deposit limits, interventions from counselling providers, services providers, things that could actually reduce real harm that would come through transparency. That's all driven underground, not to mention the taxation that the government could derive from this to try and invest in some of these community building programs. What's worse is that the states are incentivized to raise money through gambling. So, for example, we have this taxation called the GST, the Goods and Services Tax, where and it's all kind of like some states get like a net benefit from it because they're poorer, and some states lose money because they're wealthier. So, for example, the large mining states, Queensland, Western Australia, places like that, those that can generate a lot of cash, well, they tend to lose money through the GST. One of the things that's calculated in GST is how would your state raise revenue if it raised all the revenue it could, okay? And so states that have a lot of gambling raise a ton of revenue through taxing these gambling services. And then states that try to restrict gambling services forego that taxation. So, for example, Western Australia, which doesn't have these pokies outside of the main casino, they have a lot less gambling revenue. Well, they get penalised through the GST distribution because they say, well, you could be raising all this extra money if you legalised and liberalised gambling, throughout the state, and all these poorer communities, they could get on the pokies, you'd raise money. And that way we're going to give you less money through the GST distribution because you're not pulling your weight in raising revenue. It's an incredibly perverse system. And so not only are governments addicted to the money that they raise through this taxation in the forms of hundreds of millions, billions of dollars each year, they're also penalised for not doing that through a national GST distribution system that prejudices against those that are concerned about social ills. Now, what's more is that there is a company in Australia that has a monopoly on the casinos, basically. Well, not all casinos. There is the Sydney Star Casino and similarly in Queensland. But certainly the largest casino operator in Australia is Crown Resorts. Crown has a casino in Melbourne. It's one of the largest casinos in certainly the Southern Hemisphere, perhaps the world. And Perth also has a massive Crown entertainment complex. Star operates casinos in Sydney and in Queensland. And then there is a family called the Farrell family through Federal Group that controls all the casinos. The two casinos operate in Tasmania, Australia's smallest and poorest state. there's been a massive scandal in which Crown, through the Bergen inquiry in New South Wales, so Crown was seeking to open a new casino in Sydney, had invested billions into it, massive resort. And in part of getting a license, there was a serious investigation undertaken into money laundering operations that were happening allegedly through Crown Resorts, where they would engage Chinese junket operators to bring in whales from China, where a lot of the revenue came from. You get these newly wealthy kind of billionaire Chinese, hundreds of millions of dollars pouring in through Crown operations. So they would be flown into Australia on special chartered flights, lose tons of money and hire all the rooms and send back. Well, in order to build those relationships, junket operators would be illegally doing a lot of money laundering, allegedly through Crown operations, in order to facilitate getting those people on board. And this was a huge scandal to the extent that Crown was barred from operating casino in the jurisdiction of New South Wales, Australia's largest, most populated state, and meant that billions of dollars worth of investment was called into question. And then, of course, the allegations were that this was happening through Melbourne and Perth, which has started up new inquiries in both of those jurisdictions. Melbourne, the future of the casino in Melbourne has a giant question mark over it. And so is the case in WA, where a new independent inquiry has been announced. Now, I don't want to talk about that inquiry just yet, because I have some expertise in that area, and I obviously have relationships with people at Crown as a poker player. So it's not something I want to discuss, but it's very serious. It shouldn't be underestimated what's happening here. And before I kind of go on, the company that owns more pokies in Australia, the company that you would never guess it if you didn't already know, is not Crown. It's not Star Casino Resorts. It's not any of the pubs and clubs. The largest owner of pokie machines in Australia is Woolworths, Australia's largest supermarket chain, the so-called fresh food people. They have a huge marketing face of being like a family-friendly, they give kids free fruit when they come into store and all of this sort of stuff. They have all these family-friendly promotions. They really encourage a very kind of wholesome brand attitude. Well, the largest owner of pokie machines in Australia is Woolworths. They're obviously not operating in any of their branded outlets. What they do is they own those operating in the pubs and clubs throughout the nation. What to do about this? Well, I think gambling in Australia, it is part of the culture, whether we like it or not. I mean, some people say, oh, it's all, like some academics say, well, it's all the marketing operations of these huge gambling entities, which wield enormous political power, which they do, that are sort of pushing these things to make it part of the cultural norm. And yeah, they're reinforcing those messages, but those messages, I think, were already there. Australians are a pugnacious kind of rambunctious group, and the idea of risk-taking and having a punt is part of the culture. I wouldn't dismiss that. Certainly not to the extent that pokies have inflicted on our society. But what we do need is serious reform. We need to get rid of these pokies, basically. That they don't offer anything of value. They're not social. They're not part of like our social interactions. They completely just suck the lifeblood out of very desperate and vulnerable people all throughout the nation. It's a cancer on our society, and yet the taxation raised from it, our governments are addicted to, and that addiction perverts our politics in all kinds of ways. And thus, the obliteration of that particular tool for gambling is something that I think would be universally praised by the majority of Australians. It's only the small minority that have a very large amount of power that think that the pokies are a good thing. In terms of like table gambling and blackjack and roulette and all those things, I think they need to be tightened up in terms of the odds. They need to be more. The advertising needs to be more upfront. People need to have greater control over their own spend and things like that. But I don't think that they should be massively regulated. I think that they are, normal part of the culture, things that people do. Certainly, I think online it should be more liberalised, not less. And by that I mean the government should run its own gambling operations or trusted licensed operators, but with a whole series of restrictions of responsible gambling, gambling safety tools that everyone can use. I think that their gambling spend should be tracked online in such a way that people can, look after their own spending, but also intervene if they see that there are patterns of harm emerging. And also, these services could provide universal services. I mean, if we had online gambling, poker, casinos, things like that operating in Australia, government regulated and perhaps even government run, then those things could be operating in Asia to the enormous benefit of the Australian population, Australian industry, because we're on the same time zone as Tokyo, Shanghai, Beijing, Singapore, Philippines, all these markets that where people would be gambling at the same time of day as Australians. Well, if we had those things operating in Australia, we could be, raising a huge amount of money through this gambling export, but also really tracking the full scale of the problem. Because the money laundering scandal in Crown, as large as it is and as serious as it is, I think probably does pale in comparison to the sort of black gambling market that's out there. And that's not going to be stopped. Like, people will always innovate to gamble, particularly in a culture like Australia, where the attitude towards authority and restrictions on gambling is very dim, with the exception of the poker machines. In terms of harm, the Australians spend, I think it's 20 billion. Like, we're a country of 20 plus million people, so not that big. We spend about $20 billion a year just on pokies, and that's more than alcohol. It's more than all other forms. It's more than all other forms of entertainment basically combined. There's something wrong with that, and I say this as someone who's played a lot of poker and spent a lot of time in casinos around the world. We do need reform in this area. And so I think, as a gambler, I say this, as an Australian, I say this, and I'm very disappointed in some of our institutions, some of our massive brands, and Woolworths in particular, who continue to profit off the misery of so many countless people through machines that are a cancer on our culture, and don't even reinforce the culture. Finally, I'll just talk a bit about the fastest form of gambling in terms of increasing spend. So while pokies remains the biggest problem, the fastest increase in spend is through apps, people doing sports betting, and people on their phones, usually young men, often single, they will gamble on every single sporting event imaginable, with the losses just staggering amounts. And the fact that they can do this quietly without any kind of concern. The problem with gambling addictions that people have is that it's not visible to the outside until it's very, very late stages. So, if you've got an alcohol addiction or you've got a drug addiction, most people can tell that there's something going on there because it shows up manifestly in terms of your health and your physical appearance. Whereas in gambling, that's not the case. People have a deep sense of shame. They can conceal it. They can delude themselves. And as a consequence of that, you need people who are highly ethical in terms of the way they manage gambling, in order to ensure that there is external intervention. But we're hearing story after story where gambling operators, these online gambling sports betting apps, instead of doing that, instead of living up to these social responsibilities, they'll see someone has, perhaps self-excluded because they realize they have a problem off one app. And then so some other operator will get that data, that data will be sold to them, and then they contact the original person to say, hey, here's your incentive to setting up an account with us, just to sap more blood out of them. There are certain things like the online safety gambling wagering, self-exclusion registers and things like that people are signing up to. So you barred from one, you're barred from all. But those are very slow to being implemented. It's not clear how the coordination across governments are really going to work. And I'm sure that given all of this time, most of these operators have already found ways around them. So I'm just really worried about the industry. I don't mind the gambling culture that we have. I think it's part of our society, And I think for very good reasons. I think we are a pugnacious, risk-taking bunch, and it's one of the things I like about us. I also think that the pro-social element of gambling can be really good. Like, there's a lot of retirees, a lot of lonely people, a lot of people who want to be engaging with others, and this is a good way to have a social thing, a bit of excitement, to overcome sort of whatever isolation they have, and I think that's great as well. Gambling in the casino and places like that is quite physically safe. There's a lot of security, so if you're feeling like a vulnerable person, then that's a great way to get out and about and do things. So I don't have a problem with these things. I think, and as I said, I think it should be more liberal online, particularly in poker. But at the same time, there's a blood-sucking practice that's destroying our society and our communities and perverting our government. And more needs to be done in this space. And I think the problem is that the opposition to this comes from different places. Like, I think that the sort of religious right just wants to ban gambling because I think it's unethical and so on. I don't think that's the way forward. There are those that are really demonizing the industry and just sort of saying, they're good versus evil, like the beacons of light, the health promotion types, and then they just demonize everybody in the industry. I don't think that's fair. People who are in the gambling industry, they have families, they have communities, they have aunties and uncles and things like that who gamble. They understand the impact that this is having, but there are specific things, specific practices that need to be completely annihilated. And if you want to look it up, the statistics on how much we spend on gambling, it will really be an eye-opening experience for you. And if you are a gambler overseas, Australia is a great mecca to come and gamble and be part of a broader gambling culture. That's all for today on this subject. If you have any comments on this, any experiences with gambling yourself or your family, please leave them down below. I'm happy to have a discussion. And I will see you in the next video. Thank you.